Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Mrinalini Purandare from Department of Psychology, SNDT Women's University. Today we are going to talk on the topic of classical conditioning. The objectives of the topic are, at the end of this session, the learner will be able to define learning. The learner will also be able to describe the pioneer experiment in classical conditioning. The learner will be able to explain the concepts of classical conditioning, and the learner will be able to discuss the application of classical conditioning. So, let us start with classical conditioning. This is a form of learning. Learning is defined as relatively permanent change in behavior due to practice or experience. Classical conditioning is also known as Pavlovian conditioning. Ivan Pavlov, the Nobel Prize winner, Russian physiologist, was working on digestive system and in the course of this study discovered classical conditioning. In the classical conditioning experiment conducted by Pavlov, the experimental animal was a dog. The experimental condition or procedure was as follows. The experimental dog was harnessed to a platform, a small surgery was done and a tube was inserted to collect saliva. A bell was presented followed by food and saliva was collected after sighting of food by the dog. This pairing of bell and food was done for a number of trials and responses of saliva was measured. After a few trials of this pairing, it was noticed that saliva response was given by dog after the presentation of bell and before the presentation of food. This response, saliva to bell, was the learning and was termed as classical conditioning. In classical conditioning, the terms and concepts used are as follows. Unconditioned stimulus, that is US, the stimulus that produces reflexive response that occurs automatically and is not learned. In the above example of experiment with dog, food is unconditioned stimulus. Saliva is a reflex response to food and the animal does not learn to salivate at the sight of the food. Other example of unconditioned stimulus is puff of air for eye blink response and so on. Unconditioned response. This is automatic unlearned response to the unconditioned stimulus. Therefore, saliva is unconditioned response to food. Eye blink is unconditioned response to air puff. Conditioned stimulus, CS, is a neutral stimulus with reference to the unconditioned response. Thus, in the experiment on dog, the bell is the conditioned stimulus since it is a neutral stimulus with respect to conditioned response, that is saliva. The meaning of the neutral response is that it does not automatically or reflexively produce the unconditioned response. The bell does not automatically produce saliva response in the dog. Conditioned response, that is CR. The response produced by conditioned stimulus is conditioned response. It is similar to unconditioned response, but not identical. Therefore, in the dog experiment, after a number of pairing of bell, that is CS, and food, that is US, when the bell alone is presented, then if dog salivates, then it is conditioned response. Thus, this is a learned response and not a reflex response to bell. The saliva as conditioned response is similar to saliva as unconditioned response, but not identical. It may vary in intensity or other aspects. The temporal order of conditions presented in the classical conditioning experiment is as follows. CS, that is bell, followed by US, that is food, followed by UR, that is saliva. After a number of trials of pairing of bell and food, when you present CS, that is bell alone, and when you get CR, that is saliva. Thus, when CR is obtained after the presentation of CS and before the presentation of US, then it is concluded that conditioning is established. Extinction. After conditioning is established, it can be unconditioned, that is extinguished by following procedure. The number of trials are presented with CS alone without being paired with US. After a few trials with CS alone, the CR will not be given by the organism. Thus, no CR at the presentation of CS is called extinction. In the experiment on dog, after the bell, that is the CS, is presented, the dog salivates, that is CR, and then if the experimenter continues the trials with bell alone, then after a few trials, the response of salivation will stop at the ringing of the bell. This is extinction. Spontaneous recovery. When extinction takes place, that is no CR at the presentation of CS, then after a gap of some time, if the participant is brought back to the same experimental situation and the CS is presented, CR may spontaneously be given by the participant. It is called spontaneous recovery. So, in the aforementioned example of the dog experiment, after the extinction has taken place, that is no saliva CR at the ringing of the bell, that is CS, if the dog is brought back to the experimental room and the bell is presented and the dog responds by salivating, this is known as spontaneous recovery. Next is stimulus generalization. When CR is given to another neutral stimulus that is similar to the original CS, then it is known as stimulus generalization. In the example of the dog experiment, when the dog salivates to buzzer, a neutral stimulus that is similar to bell, the original CS, as well, then it is known as stimulus generalization. Gradient of stimulus generalization. The more the similarity between original CS and the new CS, the greater will be the generalization. As the similarity decreases, so the generalization. Thus, there is a gradient of stimulus generalization. In the experiment on dog example, the bell is original CS. If buzzer is presented, then CR is given by the animal, but the intensity will be lesser than if another sound such as metronome is used. You may still get CR, it will be even lower intensity than that of buzzer, and finally for alarm as CS, one may not get any CR. Stimulus discrimination. It is opposite of stimulus generalization. In generalization, CR is given not only to the original CS, but also to the similar CS. In discrimination, CR is given to only the original stimulus and not to any other similar CS. Thus, in dog's experiment, CR is given only to bell and not to buzzer. This is done by pairing original CS, that is bell, with food and not pairing it with any other similar CS, that is buzzer, with US, that is food. Higher order conditioning. In this type of conditioning, once conditioning is established with original neutral CS, that is the bell, then this CS bell is paired with another CS, that is light, and CR is elicited. When CR is elicited for CS2, that is the light, without it being paired with US, that is food, then it is called higher order conditioning. In humans, the higher order conditioning can occur at multi-level. For example, food is US and satiety is UR. Money can buy food, so the pairing of money, that is CS, with food, that is US, produces conditioning. Prestige, that is CS2, is paired with money, that is CS1, and produces first level higher order conditioning. Power, that is CS3, is paired with prestige, that is CS2, and produces second level higher order conditioning. Forward conditioning. When CS precedes US, as generally is the case, it is called forward conditioning. The fastest way of establishing conditioning is forward conditioning. Backward conditioning. When US precedes CS, then it is backward conditioning. This type of conditioning is more difficult to establish. Delay conditioning. In this conditioning, CS is presented and overlaps with presentation of US. Thus, bell is presented first and continues till food is given. Trace conditioning. In this conditioning, CS and US do not overlap. Therefore, first bell is presented and after a few seconds it is stopped. Then food is presented. Thus, there is a time gap between bell CS and food US. Additional examples of classical conditioning. If a puff of air is blown in the face, our eyes automatically, that is reflexively, blink. We do not have to learn to blink when we have been stimulated with a puff of air. Therefore, in classical conditioning terms, puff of air is the unconditioned stimulus, that is the US, that produces automatic response, that is eye blink. Eye blink is unconditioned response, that is UR, since it is automatic, that is unlearned response to puff of air. Now, if we pair light with air puff a number of times and then if we find that eye blink response is given after the presentation of light and before air puff, then we can say classical conditioning is acquired. Now, light is the conditioned stimulus. Since it is a neutral stimulus with respect to eye blink response is conditioned response since it is given in response to light and is a learned response. If the trials are given with only light and without air puff, then at one point of time eye blink response will be stopped. Therefore, the extinction of learned response will take place. After a period of time, if light is presented again and eye blink response occurs, it is spontaneous recovery. When eye blink response is given to similar light, then it is stimulus generalization. When eye blink response occurs only for the original light and no other light, then it is stimulus discrimination. If we pair light with sound a number of times and finally when sound is presented and eye blink response occurs, it is higher order conditioning. Application of classical conditioning. Conditioned emotional responses. J.B. Watson, the famous American psychologist from Behavioristic School of Psychology, conducted the famous experiment on the little Albert. The experiment was as follows. There was a small white rabbit in the experimental field. Whenever little Albert approached the white rabbit, a sudden loud noise was presented. In response to sudden loud noise, the child showed startle or fear response and would start crying. Thus, the pairing of rabbit and sudden loud noise continued for a few times. Later it was seen that as soon as the child sighted the rabbit, he would respond with fear and crying. This was the acquisition of, please stop. This was the acquisition of conditioned emotional response. In the aforementioned example, the sudden loud noise is the unconditioned stimulus. Startle or fear response is the unconditioned response. Sudden loud noise is the natural stimulus for startle or fear response. Rabbit is conditioned stimulus since it is neutral with respect to startle or fear response. When rabbit is paired with sudden loud noise and finally after presentation of only rabbit, that is conditioned stimulus, and before sudden loud noise, if fear or crying response occurs, then it is acquisition, that is learning of conditioned response. So, here CS is rabbit, US is sudden loud noise and UR is fear or crying. After a number of trials of CS and US pairing, then if CS rabbit is presented, we get CR, that is fear or crying. Then the conditioned emotional response is acquired. Stimulus generalization. When any white furry object produces fear response, then it is generalization of CER, that is conditioned emotional response. Let us take another example from real life. Children, when they are taken to the doctor or to the hospital for immunization shots, they start crying at the sight of the hospital building and sometimes even before that. This is a CER. Let us see how it is acquired. Injection, that is the US, pain or crying, that is the UR, doctor CS plus injection US produces pain or crying, that is UR. After a few pairing of doctor and injection, we get doctor, pain, that is crying. This is the acquisition of CER, that is conditioned emotional responses. Stimulus generalization will be fear crying response for anyone looking similar to doctor wearing a lab coat. Higher order conditioning. Continuing with the same example, the higher order conditioning will be as follows. First order CER, doctor, that is CS1, fear, that is crying, doctor's office, that is CS2, plus doctor produces fear or crying. Second order CSR will be doctor's office, that is CS2, producing fear, that is crying, that is CR. This is how phobias in humans develop. The stimulus generalization and higher order conditioning takes place at multiple levels and the original pairing of CS with US producing the UR is forgotten. Let us take an example of a client having phobia of closed places. When detailed case history was taken, it was found that he was attacked with a knife in an attempt at robbery in a basement parking space. This is CER that took place as follows. Parking lot, that is CS, plus knife attack, that is US, producing fear or terror, that is UR. Parking lot produces fear or terror. Stimulus generalization to all closed spaces since the parking lot was in the basement that was closed. Thus, fear or terror response is given to all the closed places through stimulus generalization. This type of response can be acquired with a single pairing of CS and US. Summary: Classical conditioning is also known as Pavlovian conditioning, named after Russian physiologist who first discovered it during his work in the field of digestive systems. The basic idea behind classical conditioning is as follows. If a neutral stimulus, that is CS, is paired with a natural stimulus, that is US, that produces a natural response, that is UR, then after a few trials of such pairing, the neutral stimulus, that is the CS, will produce the natural response, that is the CR. When this happens, it is called the acquisition of conditioned, that is learned response. The acquired response can be extinguished by continuously not pairing the neutral stimulus, that is the CS, with the natural stimulus, that is the US. At one point, the conditioned response will stop. This is the extinction of conditioned, that is learned response. Other important concepts in classical conditioning are spontaneous recovery, stimulus generalization, stimulus discrimination, and higher order conditioning. One of the major applications of classical conditioning is conditioned emotional response. The pioneer work in this field was done by J.B. Watson. Once it is known that our emotional responses are conditioned, then principles of classical conditioning can be used to uncondition them. This is done through behavior modification techniques. Thank you.